know about this.
This is the Warrior Woman Award.
All right.
International Working Women's Day, March 8th. The Detroit branch of Workers' World Party salutes Warrior Woman, Comrade Deirdre Griswold. And it says, for your decades of exemplary leadership in Workers' World Party and as editor of Workers' World newspaper, because of women like you, socialism will one day triumph.
You know, I want to talk about the women in our party, and there's just like so much to say, so I've kind of narrowed it down. What Chris was saying about me is true, but it's only part of the truth, because I was actually kind of like a party brat from the time I was about 4, which was 70 years ago, not 50. Because the people who went on to found Workers' World Party were in another party for many years and developed big differences with that party over both international and domestic issues. And I want to talk about some of those women, because the thing about them that I think that made every one of them strong and confident and a real fighter was the experience of the Depression. And you know, we're living in such perilous times now, and you here, you are at the epicenter of the crisis for the working class that capitalism is bringing to the United States. And it's the biggest crisis since that Depression for the workers in general. Even though there's been many other crises and much suffering, especially in oppressed communities of color since then, in the period. But now it's like a generalized crisis affecting workers all over. And it was that kind of a crisis of capitalism that shaped the women that I'm going to talk about. And we know our struggle is a long one. You know, just like the struggle against slavery was a long struggle. There was Nat Turner, and there were many rebellions before there was finally the biggest, most costly war in U.S. history, in which the ruling class decided after the war had started, their Civil War, many years into the Civil War, that they'd better sign that Emancipation Proclamation, because there were black soldiers in uniform by that time, and the population would have rebelled if they had not done that. And so they did it. But that struggle to end slavery took generations and generations, it took centuries. But we remember every one of those, you know, we commemorate every one of those great leaders. And we need to do that about our own history in this struggle against capitalism, which is, you know, it's been a difficult one. What's been very difficult, though, for the last 50, 60 years or so, is that we've been in a period of real reaction in which the working class as a whole has not been the militant force that it once was. But we're seeing the conditions now be laid to arouse that kind of militant consciousness. We are seeing it. So I want to talk about who some of these women were who became founding members of our party, and what their lives were like, and how that intersected, you know, with the economic conditions. I want to start with Dorothy Bell, because she did so much to shape the party and build it, both in organizational ways, in the development of individual comrades, women and men, and in theoretical contributions. Now, Dorothy's parents came to the United States from Odessa, which was a port city on the Black Sea, part of the Ukraine, which had been part of Tsarist Russia. At the time that her parents left, it was still Tsarist Russia. It later became, after the Russian Revolution, a republic of the Soviet Union. And the people who came from that part of the world followed very closely what was happening with the revolution, especially the Jewish community in Brooklyn, which is where she was born. Some of you know Sharon Eolas, a wonderful, hard-working, terrific comrade, and a nurse who's in New York City. And she was Dottie's niece. Dottie, introduced her to Workers' World Party. And she told me that only recently did she find out from her family that Dottie's mother had been illiterate her whole life. She couldn't read or write, because that was how poor and oppressed were the community that they came from. However, after they got here and got jobs, her family scrimped and they saved, and they sent Dottie and her sisters to college. And she did very well. She was very brilliant, and she was going to be a teacher. But Dottie didn't become a teacher. She got political at a very early age, and she instead became an organizer for a union of paper box workers. Now, this was an industry in New York City that employed almost all poor immigrant women. That's where Dottie met Sam Marcy, who was the theoretical leader and founder of our party. But this was long before. This was, maybe 25 years before that happened, before the party was founded. After she met Sam, they together helped to build a militant caucus inside the union. And they won some very important victories for the workers there. And that was very difficult, because this was during the worst of the Depression, and you know how it is when there's 10 people looking for a job. The boss feels that they can get away with almost anything, and you'll have to take it, right? They made some big victories, and Sam and Dottie were responsible for thinking up a lot of good strategies in how to fight the boss. And I can just assume that she had to resist her family in order to make the life decisions that she did, because every family wants their kids to do better than them, and they had sent her to college and all that. Around 1945, she and Sam came to Buffalo. That's where I lived. And he became organizer of the branch that existed there. And they came to Buffalo quite deliberately because it was a center of heavy industry, where there was tremendous potential for working class struggle. Now, Dottie got a job in Westinghouse Electric, probably again to the disappointment of her family. And she worked that and other jobs on the side so that Sam could be a full-time organizer. Now, this wasn't because she was subordinate to Sam, but, as a matter of fact, she had her own ideas, and very often in a discussion, she would contradict him. She was not some person who just did nothing to say, oh yes, you're wonderful. But what she did was she made this great sacrifice because she recognized in Sam Marcy that he had great genius, both in theory and in the practical building of a revolutionary party. She worked in Westinghouse at a time when the anti-communist red-baiting period, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, that Comrade Hines was talking about, was at its height.